When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. My fingers stretch out, seeking Prim's warmth, but finding only the rough canvas cover of the mattress. These are the first two sentences opening the Hunger Games series as a whole, and with just these two sentences, we are foretold exactly how the story will play out. Katniss starts the series by reaching out for Prim and finding nothing but cold. As we know, Katniss's entire journey throughout the whole Hunger Games series is a mission to protect Prim. She will try time and time again to reach out to her, to protect her, to keep her safe, and inevitably Prim will continue to slip through her fingers until at the end there is nothing more that Katniss can do. These two sentences also give us an insight into Katniss's character. Even while half asleep and just waking up, Katniss is the type of person to reach out for someone and to check that they are safe and warm. It is in her very nature. The bedding itself is also described as being a rough canvas, which shows us that Katniss does not live in a sense of comfort. With just these two opening sentences, we have been told that the protagonist is someone who will try and protect Prim, but inevitably fail at that. They are someone who is incredibly protective, even when half asleep. That is their natural instinct. And also they are someone who does not live in comfort or luxury. In just two sentences, Suzanne Collins has set the scene for the entire series. And make no mistake, despite the fact that there is a love story and a love triangle of sorts throughout the book, Katniss's relationship with Prim is the integral heart of the story. Later on in the chapter, Katniss says, "I protect Prim in every way I can, but I'm powerless against the reaping." And the irony of this is, she isn't. Katniss is so cynical and so defeated that she will never realize her own power until she's put at a crossroads. And it is Prim being put in danger that forces her into this first crossroads and kicks off the entire story. This leads us on to Katniss's beautiful narrative voice. My mother was very beautiful once too, or so they tell me. Sitting at Prim's knees, guarding her, is the world's ugliest cat. The last thing I needed was another mouth to feed. Katniss's narrative voice doesn't have any flowery arrangements to it. There's no embellishments. She is a very dry, cynical, and matter-of-fact, blunt character. And initially when reading, this can come off as quite cold and detached, which is why it is so important to look at the subtext of what Katniss is doing versus what her narrative voice is telling us. We're still on page 1 when Katniss bemoans the fact that she doesn't want another mouth to feed when she's talking about the cat. At this point, we know next to nothing about Katniss other than what her narrative voice tells us and what her actions tell us. We don't even know that she is a she. We don't even know her name. What we do know is that this is a person who has taken over the caretaker role of the family. This is someone who seems more cutthroat and practical than the beaten down mother and the more gentle and lovely Prim. And this aspect of Katniss's character, where her narrative voice conflicts directly with her actions, is no more evident than on page 3. But there's also food if you know how to find it. My father knew, and he taught me some before he was blown to bits in a mine explosion. There was nothing even to bury. I was 11 then. 5 years later, I still wake up screaming for him to run. The matter-of-fact way that Katniss describes her father's death almost makes her seem unfeeling. But we know that this isn't the case because 2 sentences on, she describes still waking up screaming for him to run. And from this, we can infer that the casual description of her father's death is less to do with her being cold inside and more to do with the banality of trauma that her life has become, which quickly makes her a very sympathetic character and someone that you want to root for. In this chapter, we're also given an insight into the world that Katniss lives in, into the setting that is being presented to us through the lens of a very poor community. From very subtle things like Prim gifting Katniss a small ball of cheese and protecting it under a bowl on the table from the rats that could try to eat it, to more complex descriptions. Our part of District 12, nicknamed the Seam, is usually crawling with coal miners heading out to the morning shift at this hour. Men and women with hunched shoulders, swollen knuckles, many of whom have since stopped trying to scrub the coal dust out of their broken nails, the lines of their sunken faces. In this paragraph on page 2, we get a really clear idea of the level of poverty that the community that Katniss lives in faces. With hunched shoulders, swollen knuckles, broken nails, and sunken faces, we understand that these are people who break their very bodies trying to work and yet still can't afford to have a full meal. We're lucky enough to get 2 or 3 free hours of electricity in the evenings. Most of the peacekeepers turn a blind eye to the few of us who hunt because they're as hungry for fresh meat as anybody is. Even those implied to be in law enforcement are starving, so it's not just that this poverty is limited to the social class within the district that Katniss is in, it's an entire district that is struggling. This is no longer a small facet of a community that is struggling, it is a systematic and fundamental problem within an entire region. And soon we are introduced to the character of Gale, the only person with whom I can be myself. Gale. Katniss and Gale essentially start the story as mirrors of the same person. They are both outspoken rebels who have learned over time to hold their tongues in public, but they provide for their families as well as protect those who are less fortunate. But crucially, it is only together in the woods where either of them can truly relax and be themselves. Katniss and Gale's relationship throughout the series is one of the most important ones because it showcases how two people who can come from essentially the exact same life can go through such different paths just based on experiences. They think the same, they act the same, they are essentially the same person at the very beginning of this series, and they end completely different people. And it's interesting that Katniss immediately describes her relationship with Gale as something easy and relaxed, and something that feels very comforting and familiar to her. He could be my brother, but we're not related, at least not closely. Katniss is very quick to attribute a sibling relationship to Gale. He feels like family to her. But despite this supposed ease that Katniss tells us they have, we are immediately presented with tension within their relationship in just chapter 1. If we didn't have so many kids, he adds quickly. This conversation feels all wrong. Leave? How could I leave Prim, who is the only person in the world I'm certain I love? And Gale is devoted to his family. We can't leave, so why bother talking about it? And even if we did, where did all this stuff about having kids come from? There's never been anything romantic between Gale and me. The first time we are introduced to Gale, he is presenting him and Katniss as a pairing already, a couple who has children to look after. And Katniss is quick to be both affronted and confused by this. You can tell by the way girls whisper about him when he walks by in school that they want him. It makes me jealous, but not for the reason that people would think. Good hunting partners are hard to find. Here we start to wonder whether Katniss is trying to convince herself that she isn't jealous of all the girls who want Gale, or if she genuinely is talking about finding a hunting partner. It has already been established that Katniss's narrative voice is unreliable, so when we read this, we cannot be certain that Katniss doesn't have romantic feelings for Gale, and is just suppressing them because she has too much else on her plate, and too much else she has to worry about. And despite being very, very similar people, there is one key difference between the two of them. His rages seem pointless to me, although I never say so. It's not that I don't agree with him, I do, but what good is yelling about the capital in the middle of the woods? Despite agreeing, despite all the similarities, Katniss is much more defeated than Gale. She's accepting of the world that they live in, although she hates it, and much more cynical about the fact that there could be any change. Gale has a fight in him, an internal rage that he desperately wants to direct somewhere, but he doesn't know how or when or where. Katniss does not have this internal fight. Her fight is just getting through each day, looking to survive. She is very much someone who lives in the moment. Gale is someone who looks to the future. And it's ironic then that in Gale's introduction to us, in his very first scene, one of his first lines, he essentially establishes that he will not be the target of the story. He will not be the face of the rebellion. In fact, it will be Peeta. Look what I shot. Gale holds up a loaf of bread with an arrow stuck in it. This loaf of bread is not only confirmed to be from the bakery, which we can infer is the one that Peeta's father works at by the line, "The old man was feeling sentimental this morning," it also symbolizes Peeta and Katniss's relationship. The arrow through the bread. Peeta's story will inevitably become intertwined with Katniss's. The arrow through the bread can also symbolize that eventually it is Katniss, or rather Peeta's love for Katniss, that ends up breaking Peeta. The final relationship we get introduced to in chapter 1 is the one between Katniss and her mother. She must have really loved him to leave her home for the scene. I try to remember that when all I can see is the woman who sat by, blank and unreachable, while her children turned to skin and bones. Katniss does not understand her mother. She makes this incredibly clear. She also does not forgive her mother for essentially abandoning her children after their father's death. And no matter anyone's understanding of depression, Katniss's response of anger towards being abandoned or feeling abandoned is very valid. Katniss was 11 years old when her father died, and she essentially became the main provider for her family. We understand very clearly here why Katniss is so cutthroat and brutal and almost cold seeming, because she's angry. And because she doesn't want to be in this life, but she also does not see any way out of it. What is quite sad about the way that Katniss views her mother in not understanding her sadness and her depression is that Katniss is later doomed to almost have that same fate. Massive spoiler here for those who have not read the series and do want to keep it a surprise, but at the end of the series, after Prim's death, Katniss becomes that version of her mother. She becomes blank and unreachable and almost allows herself to starve to death because she just can't bring herself to care. And just through Katniss's narrative voice, we get the impression that Katniss's mother doesn't even have the capacity to love her children. But again, Katniss's narrative voice directly conflicts with the actions on the page. To my surprise, my mother has laid out one of her own lovely dresses for me, a soft blue thing with matching shoes. Are you sure? I ask. I'm trying to get past rejecting offers from help from her. For a while I was so angry I wouldn't allow her to do anything for me, and this is something special. Her clothes from her past are very precious to her. Katniss's mother tries to care and show her love in the only way that she seems capable of doing. The love appears to be there, but the ability to actively care is not. And this is just a very sad, ironic moment on page 13, but they prepare a meal to eat after the reaping, a very special meal. So they eat kind of like grains and not that very nice things for lunch in preparation that they know they're gonna have a really nice dinner later on. But Katniss never gets to eat this meal. And Katniss, we know, is a character who lives moment to moment. She tends to enjoy immediately what is in front of her if it's there. And the one time she plans ahead, she doesn't really get to enjoy it. Which brings us to one of Nico Delort's artworks. One thing I love about the style of these artworks is that there's a depth to them and a grit to them that you don't often see in textual illustrations. The harsh contrast between the light and dark really make you feel like you're in the moment with them, that you could almost reach into the page. Some interesting aspects that Nico has added to this first image is that we have Katniss's mother with her arms around her daughter, attempting to show affection and care on what is inevitably the hardest day they go through each year. We also have Katniss looking at her mother, directly side-eyeing her as if she's skeptical. There's like a furrow in her brow and she's not sure exactly how to make sense of her mother acting this way. Whereas Prim, sweet little tiny Prim, is looking up to Katniss, as she always has and as she always will. We also have Katniss's mother, who seems to not really be looking at anyone in particular, more just looking off into the distance, really emphasizing the fact that she is lost in the world ever since her husband's death. And finally, we have little Buttercup sat right beside Prim and looking up to his most prized possession, Prim herself. This first image gives us the entire family dynamics of the Edine family. What I also really like is that Nico added a bow to the back of Katniss's dress. This really highlights the fact that she is just a young girl. We sometimes lose sight of this when in the films 20-year-olds were cast as the main characters when they're actually 16 in the books. And I understand why they cast 20-year-olds due to, you know, child labor laws and all of that. But we do forget that these characters are meant to be children, and something as simple as having a bow on the back of her dress really heightens that fact. One final thing I want to point out is that Katniss describes the mirror as being cracked, but I find it interesting that Nico has chosen to have that crack go through her mother and Katniss herself. It just really emphasizes the fact that there is a divide between them. We are also introduced to the capital in this first chapter, the shining capital of Panem, the rulers who saved everyone, who triumphantly won the War of the Dark Days and obliterated District 13, and now holds every other district under their iron fist. The reaping is a good opportunity for the capital to keep tabs on the population as well. This is a very simple sentence, but if we dig deeper into it, we understand that this is more than just population. By forcing all young people into the same square where there's going to be cameras everywhere, the capital can also monitor the amount of able-bodied potential fighters. They can monitor whether there's dissonance and unrest in the districts, on whether or not people refuse to show up. Just with population alone, they can also monitor whether or not a troubling sector of a certain district has a higher population than other ones. We also quickly understand the Hunger Games as a concept. It's about fear. That is what Katniss describes here. It is the capital's way of ensuring that no one rises up against them. They use fear to beat people into submission. Monitoring the districts is an essential part of this. It ensures that no uprising has time to really percolate. The Hunger Games broadcasts fear every year across an entire nation, but it also controls what hope is. It creates this victor, this glorious person who is showered in riches and praise, and creates this false idea that the only way to earn hope is through the Hunger Games. They don't just let people be scared, they also provide them with hope, and that is why it continues year after year. The final thing that we're introduced to in this opening chapter is the theme of berries. I'll discuss this in more detail later, but know that berries often symbolize the idea of love, the abundance of nature, of new beginnings, of life, and they are very prevalent throughout this first book. In this first chapter, Gale shares some berries with Katniss, and if we look at berries as an idea and as a symbol, this can symbolize the idea of new beginnings, of something new starting in their lives, which very soon after, they are propelled into something incredibly new. The first chapter is quite cyclical in nature because it starts with Katniss reaching out for Prim and not being able to find her, and it ends with Prim's name being called out at the reaping. Essentially, Katniss finding that Prim is being pulled away from her again. And that concludes chapter 1. See you next time.